Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at a video and do a reaction to it. It's how did the Great Depression affect the rest of the world? But also, what we're going to talk about, I'm kind of mix and matching here. If you have heard, over the last couple of days, there have been a couple of bank failures in the US. We've talked about it a lot on the Discord. There have been a lot of kind of back and forth questions and thoughts and things of that nature. So I thought I would get into it a little bit of how exactly this happens, right? How bank runs happen. They obviously have played a big role historically in a lot of different situations. So before I get into the video, I am going to talk a little bit about it and look a little bit about how bank runs work. So I'm going to pull up a graph real quick. Okay, so this is the general idea of how banks work, right? You give your money to the bank, you are a creditor to the bank. Like you are literally giving them money as like a loan, money that you can take back at any moment. So it's short-term lending and it can be extremely short-term, okay? The banks then lend that money but it's long-term lending. There's like a set date on it. So whether it's for a car or a house or they're buying treasuries or securities or whatever they're doing, they're loaning that money out. And in fractional reserve lending, the way that this works is they can lend up to a certain amount on top of your money. So for instance, say they can do a 10 times loan. So for every dollar they get from you, they can loan out $10 total. That's typically the way fractional reserve lending works. Although depending on where it is, the numbers may change slightly on how much they're able to leverage that dollar that you give them. The bank pays the interest to you for the money that you've lent them because they're borrowing your money. This is typically at least the reason that's sold as to why they're investing it. Okay? You're loaning them money, and so to be able to give you a return on it, they have to go out and sort of hunt for yield, right? Yield being, of course, interest on money that they're loaning out, okay? So you earn interest from the bank for the money that you've lent them, but this is where we're going to get into what happened here. Silicon Valley Bank, which is one of the banks that collapsed, they were buying a lot of stuff they really shouldn't have been and not really hedging any of their risk. The issue with buying something like government treasuries, if you were buying T-bills, buying treasuries of the US government supposedly or supposed to be the safest investment you could possibly make. The issue with that is if interest rates go up, there's an inverse correlation between interest rates and the price of the treasury. So as interest rates go up, the price of the treasuries come down, which means that if you were to go out and sell those treasuries on the market, you could sell them, but they would be worth less than when you bought them for if you bought them when interest rates were low and now they're high. This is basically what happened. They didn't just buy treasuries, they went and bought mortgage-backed securities and commercial mortgage-backed securities, but I'm going to deal with treasuries because it's sort of the simplest layer of this. Say you buy, you get a rush of deposits at your bank, okay? You go and buy the safest investment you can. Basically, what to regulators will look like cash reserves. You buy 10-year treasuries, okay? You buy them when the interest rate is almost at 0%. Then, because of inflation, the Federal Reserve comes in and hikes interest rates up. What happens? The face value of those treasuries that you hold goes down. Now, if you hold them to maturity, doesn't matter. You'll still get back the money you put in plus the interest, whatever the agreement was when you bought them. But if, for instance, 30% of your depositors want their money back in a couple of days, you have to then go out into the market and sell those treasuries in order to get the money to pay back your depositors. Well, interest rates are up, you know, 500 basis points from where they were when they bought them. And so they were all worth a hell of a lot less than they were when they bought them. And they started eating losses like they couldn't handle. Now, a lot of people hate fractional reserve lending, think it's stupid, all of that. I don't actually fall in that camp. I think if you're trying to expand credit, which is sort of how our economic system runs, now, I don't totally agree with that viewpoint, but that's a different story. If that's the way we're going to run the global economy, then fractional reserve lending makes sense to me. And 99.9% of the time, it works fine. But it's the whole system is built on trust and faith in the banking system. And that 0.01% of the time when that faith and trust fails, there just isn't enough money to cover all of the deposits. It's just not possible because everybody is lending more than is being deposited, right? And so it's very easy for banks to start collapsing very quickly. Obviously, there were bank runs that, leading into the Great Depression here in the U.S., which is what the video is about to talk about. I'm going to put together an entire video on how a couple of different historical bank runs have happened, but that's a general overview of it. If anybody has any questions or comments about it or anything like that, put them down in the comments, or just get my attention somehow, and we can have a back and forth about it. But now that that's all out of the way, let's get into it. The Great Depression.
The Great Depression sucked for a lot of people. When it's discussed, it's often only in reference to the United States or Germany and the impact that it had on their societies. But what about the other major powers in the world? How much, if at all, did the Great Depression affect them, and how did their leaders try to deal with it? So, as you'll probably know, the Great Depression began in the late 1920s. This led to businesses collapsing, people losing their jobs, those people then had less money to spend, meaning other businesses couldn't sell stuff, meaning theirs went bust, and so forth.
Yeah, so this is how it happens, right? And this is with Silicon Valley Bank. This was the big worry, was you had a ton of depositors in that bank that were not insured. They had way more money in their accounts than the $250,000 that's insured by the FDIC here in the United States. If a bank fails and you have $250,000 or less, the FDIC covers it. The FDIC works like a general insurance company. Banks pay into it. They get kind of a war chest, and they can pay out for depositors whenever a bank fails. But if you have more than that, anything above that is not covered by the FDIC. During the Great Depression, there was no FDIC, so deposits weren't covered at all. If a bank failed, those deposits were just gone. Well, what if a local bank had a bunch of businesses for the area that all did their banking? They use that bank for their business. Well, the bank goes under, all of those businesses are getting dragged down with it. And so very quickly, as you can kind of see how this cycle would start. You have one bank, confidence is shaky, people go start pulling out deposits, it collapses. Okay? All of the businesses associated with that bank then can't make payroll. They can't, get new inventory. They collapse. Well, all of the other businesses in the county or region or state, whatever, they look at that and say, okay, well, then I'm getting all of my money out of the bank because I don't want that to happen to me. When they start all pulling their money out, those banks collapse too, and the cycle just continues. As that happens, more businesses close down, which means more people are without jobs, both the owners and the people that work there. They have less money to spend, which means that businesses that even aren't affected by a bank directly, they're having shortcomings. Nobody's buying their inventory, and it leads to economic calamity very quickly. And it's very hard to kind of regather your footing once it happens.
This led to a downward spiral that saw international trade collapse. So how did it affect the great powers? Polar opposite to the United States was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, one of the two communist countries in the world at this point. And given that they were under international sanction and barred from most cross-border trade, the Great Depression had very little effect on it. In fact, being able to point to declining capitalist economies was a massive propaganda boon, especially when combined with the 100,000 US citizens that went to the Soviet Union for a better life, just in time for the coming purges. The lack of opportunities in the rest of the world saw many technical experts head to the USSR to help set up factories, which meant that as a result the USSR saw substantial economic growth whilst the rest of the world declined, an effect which helped to bolster support for communism across numerous countries.
Yeah, there's a specific factory, I can't remember the name of it, but God, I just read about it, and I'm not going to be able to remember the name. But basically, there was this huge factory that was put up, and it was sort of pointed to as the big deal for the Soviet Union. Like, this is what communism brings. This is the cutting edge of technology and manufacturing and all that. Well, come to find out, it wasn't actually even really built there. It was sort of like piecemealed together in the West and then shipped in parts and like wholesale put together once it got into the Soviet Union. But yes, it was a coup for the Soviet Union in regards to propaganda.
In Britain, the Great Depression was different to the United States in that the British government had cleverly prepared for it. You see, it's impossible to enter an economic depression if you never left one, which was the case for the UK, which had been in a prolonged economic downturn since the end of the First World War. The British government panicked and sought to balance its budget because it was running out of gold reserve.
Yep, I think they handled it very, very well. That's my personal opinion, but I'm a fan of how Britain handled the situation.
As such, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald sought to raise taxes and cut spending, which his party, the Labour Party, couldn't countenance. As such, he quit the Labour Party and then formed a new Labour Party and governed with the Conservatives. Britain would recover from the Depression by 1935, because the only way was up at that point. This was mostly due to it leaving the gold standard and thus being able to devalue the pound to boost exports. And unemployment went down fairly quickly after Britain began a programme of mass rearmament, just in case that new...
Okay, so that's broadly what happened. Essentially what they did was they did raise taxes, and it really worsened the depression initially, right? Debasing the currency, flooding the market with more liquidity, putting more money into the system, eventually is what started enabling them to get their footing. And then obviously with more people working and businesses kind of coming out on the upward trajectory, the tax raise, which was 1.5%, 2%, something along those lines, I believe. Basically, it ends up coming out in the wash. But I think providing liquidity into the system, allowing companies to get cheaper than usual money was generally the good way to go about it. I mean, it's the making the best out of a bad situation, I guess.
German government got up to something. France avoided the worst of the crisis because it was much more self-sufficient in things like agriculture and manufacturing. There was a mild effect on employment, but France's decline was mild compared to Italy's, America's or Germany's. It did, however, take a long time for France to recover from this decline relative to other nations because it fiercely held on to the gold standard. Many in France hated the idea of devaluing the franc, and so it wasn't until 1936 that they actually came off the gold standard and devalued their currency to boost exports. Italy was similar in that it also fiercely stuck to the gold standard, but the government there also saw the Great Depression as an opportunity. When important businesses collapsed, the government stepped in, and given that it ran a surplus, it was able to use excess money to continue paying wages and producing goods. Italy's economy was the second in Europe to recover after Britain's, and the crisis gave Italy's government near complete control over its economy, which it would soon turn to war. Outside of Europe, Japan was the first major economy to recover from the Great Depression. This was because its government opted to immediately devalue its currency and spend a bunch of it on keeping businesses open. This led to Japan's economy growing quite rapidly whilst the European powers were still stagnant, meaning that the Japanese economy was much better prepared for foreign adventures. The major powers had mostly recovered by the beginning of the Second World War, but it wasn't until the mid-1950s that all of them had beaten their pre-depression metrics. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Sky Chappelle, Corsho Wolf, Jerry Lambdin, Jordan Longley, Adam...
Okay, so that was a very, very short video on how exactly countries handled the Great Depression. I have not looked at all of those countries. Britain is one that I've looked at. Italy is one that I've looked at. And Japan is one that I've looked at because, yes, Japan has a relative boom. That sort of is surprising to see for the era. But again, there's all sorts of different theories of economics or schools of economic thought. I think in this situation, you're going to have something inject liquidity into the system. So whether that is the government taking out debt and pushing that liquidity into the system, whether it is debasing the currency and then pushing that liquidity into the system, in some way, shape, or form, you are going to have to get liquidity through the system because there's money's dying faster than you can do anything because all of these banks are failing. And when those deposits are gone, that the money just disappears. The money's gone, and then the business that the bank lent to, it's gone. And so literally money is basically, you can imagine it as if money is burning faster than it can be created. That's a huge problem. And so you have these countries debasing their currency. Then what happens is you can't really trade very well with countries that haven't done that because there's such a big mismatch with whether you're paying with the francs or with pounds or with dollars or whatever, that you're taking too big of a loss if you're coming in from one of those other countries. So it's sort of a complicated issue. I won't get too much into the weeds, here, but I do want to make another video on how these historical bank runs have happened. I'm going out of town tomorrow. I'm taking all of my recording stuff with me, and I'm hoping to hammer out like 5 or 6 videos over the next couple of days. So I may just be absolutely flooding the channel. If everything goes well, that is what I'll be doing. I've had the kids home for the whole little bit. I haven't been able to make very many videos. So going out of town, gonna get away from everybody for a little bit and hopefully hammer out quite a few videos. So be on the lookout for those. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.